Like Bernie is on the phone? 2019. Yeah, he's on the line. Yeah. I think, is he the only cast going to be on the phone?
No, he is. No, she is.
Let me see. Can you see if the name, I need to see if anybody from quality behavioral health. Nobody's from there.
Not that's identified.
Our plan with that is that if they don't end up on that probably be time for them probably bring them up. I guess then that'll be like
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a task learning collaborative today. So we want to make sure we give enough time to our presenters to have able to present their information that they're bringing. We're so excited to hear from our ASO as well as our crisis providers. So we're not going to do any introductions in the room today for the time-wise. And then if you're on the phone, can you please make sure you put your name in the chat box and what organization you're from. And if you're in the room, just make sure that you sign in. And then also just a reminder for next month's Learning Collaborative is Allison Masari, and she is amazing. So I really hope everybody can come. It's actually going to be at Pacific Northwest University, and it's on the back of the agenda today. So we'll go ahead and turn this over.
Thank you. Go ahead and put this in here. Okay, my name is Chris Brown, and I'm a clinical behavioral specialist at Greater Columbia Behavioral Health, the ASO. And that stands for administrative. Sorry.
You have to talk in the microphone because they have people on. There's like 25.
Oh, let me see. I don't know if I can make it taller.
So we are the administrative.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I work for Greater Columbia Behavioral Health, ASO for Administrative Services Organization. Just want to give a really brief kind of history of our transition we've made over the last year plus from what's previously called a BHO. We were still called Greater Columbia Behavioral Health. We were a behavioral health organization up until January 1st of 2019. So prior to 2019, we were in charge of administrating behavioral health funding on both Medicaid and then also the state-only funding for crisis services and then the other non-Medicaid funding programs. So as part of the transition within the state of switching over to fully integrated care, that started in 2016, kind of in region by region. In our region, that happened in 2019. So as of 2019, all of the Medicaid health administrative duties were shifted over to the managed care organizations under Apple Health, in addition to the medical coverage that they were already providing. So at that time is when we became an ASO instead of a BHO, and our role shifted from being involved in administering the Medicaid funding to being involved in only administering the state-only funding, which is separate from the Medicaid funding. And that state-only funding goes to provide the crisis services in our region. And there are some other things that it goes to. One of the primary ones also is if someone is involuntarily detained under a Voluntary Treatment Act, and they are a non-Medicaid individual, does not have active Medicaid, then we are the guarantor to pay for that hospitalization if there are no other means to pay. So someone might have Kaiser insurance. If I were to get detained into a hospital, they're going to try to build Kaiser insurance. If for some reason my insurance doesn't pay, or it's no longer active, or I don't have insurance to begin with, or it's in a facility that they don't cover, then the payer of last resort would be the ASO, and we would be responsible to making sure that facility does get paid for providing involuntary treatment services to that individual. So that is our primary role. We operate in 9 counties. Those counties are Soden, Benton, Columbia, Franklin, Garfield, Kittitas, Walla Walla, Whitman, and Yakima. We have 5 different crisis providers across that region that are providing the services. We have most, if not all of them, will be able to talk some today, and we'll turn it over to them pretty quickly because most of what we want is to be able to have our crisis providers kind of explain in their words and the experiences they have as kind of what crisis delivery looks like, and to be able to potentially answer any questions people have as it relates to those crisis services. Before we turn it over to them, we did want to have my coworker Sarah here. Another role we have is running the FISPERT, a local FISPERT, and Sarah can talk about that a little bit before we get over to the providers.
Hi, I'm Sarah Gillard, and I work also with the Greater Columbia ASL as a behavioral clinical specialist, and I'm also the FISPERT coordinator. FISPERT stands for Family Youth System Partner Roundtable. The FISPERT is a platform for youth and families, system partners, and communities to collaborate and address the needs of the community and take that to the state so that their voices can be heard on what are the needs specific to your local community. And so our FISPERT covers all of the 9 regions, or all of the 9 counties, but each region has a FISPERT. Some of them have 2 because of the expansive or the distance within the region. Sometimes there's local FISPERTs, and then they report to a regional FISPERT, and then those FISPERTs report to a quarterly statewide FISPERT meeting in Olympia. I provided some handouts at the back. We do have a website, and our FISPERT meetings are held at Phoenix High School the 2nd Thursday of the month. We have a 3:30 to 4 chill session that's youth focused, and we like to use that time to interact with the youth. And also sometimes we have activities. Last year we had a mental health awareness activity in May where the youth did a art project, and that artwork is displayed at the crisis center here in Atwood. And so we're also looking at other ways we can collaborate with other system partners and other community events so that we can address fully the needs of our community.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we're going to bring up Lourdes first, and just as the plan will be that Lourdes will speak about some of the service here. We'll have a different crisis provider also speaking throughout. If people have questions, we'd like them to hold them towards the end if possible, and then try to target the question to have the answer come from the person that would be in the region where that question might apply. So, you know, if you have questions very specific to Benton and Franklin counties, you know, we want to have Lourdes handling those questions. They're the crisis providers actually operating here. So even though all of our providers provide the same essential crisis functions, you know, how they look in the community and how the kind of the specifics of it can differ across our region. We are dealing with 9 different counties, and our crisis providers have, you know, have ways they can deliver crisis services that aren't always just exactly the same throughout. So we don't want a crisis provider from a different county necessarily.
They're just being put on hallway.
So, with that said, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Cameron.
I have them online if you want to come talk to them, or if you want to.
Yeah, let me switch over, and I'll be ready.
Okay. Ready for your PowerPoint?
Yes. Check that guy, and then put it in PowerPoint mode. Want to give her a test run? Test click? Oh, the clicker.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
I have 2 cams, one has a microphone, the other one has a clicker. So at least And there's only grapes, so you can't throw tomatoes or anything at me too, so.
You're armed and dangerous, Cameron.
I am, right. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Cameron Fortmeyer. I'm the patient manager at Lawrence, and one of my core departments is crisis services. So Chris did set that up correctly, so we will go over ITA law just in general at first, because that is the thing that we all go off of, but then again, we do have individual resources, individual programs, so the way we go about it and how it looks is a little bit different. So this first part will just be covering kind of the stuff that's the same for everybody. So the Involuntary Treatment Act, when you hear ITA evaluation, that's what they're referring to. And so ITA law is covered under RCW 7105 for adults and RCW 7134 for children and adolescents. If you're bored, look it up, riveting stuff, feel free. Prior to April 2018, detentions were due to mental disorders. So April 2018, they changed that and added substance use disorders, so we don't have the chicken or egg comment anymore. So is it drug related due to the drugs and alcohol, or is it due to mental illness, or is that argument goes away now? It's under both. So if somebody is suicidal and they're drunk, it doesn't matter if they're suicidal and depressed or suicidal, depressed and drunk, it's all under the same stuff. So evaluations under ITA have to be done by designated crisis responders. So after that change in April 2018, they were mental health professionals, but adding the substance use disorder into that, it changed to designated crisis responders. So DCRs are tasked with determining, as a result of a mental disorder or substance use disorder, whether somebody needs to have a legal plan. Cool, look at that. Danger to self, danger to others. There is a fourth criteria. We don't use it very much here because it's danger to property. Typically, I would roll that into grave disability, but there is that. It has to be over $500, I believe, and it can't be joint property. So if your significant other destroys your property, sorry, that's joint property. It doesn't count. And then grave disability is that third category. We'll get into some of these more as we progress. So for an ITA evaluation, so when you hear a lot of myths in crisis, and one of the things that you hear is that you have to go to the ER and you have to be medically cleared to do an evaluation. You can go to the ER and you can get medically cleared, but that's not a requirement to get an actual ITA evaluation. So requesting an evaluation can go through dispatch. You can call your local crisis. You can have law enforcement come out, but those evaluations can take place at anywhere. So law requires DCRs to consider any and all least restrictive alternatives to hospitalization prior to detention, if appropriate. And so what does that mean? There's two things. We'll cover both LRAs. So LRA stands for least restrictive alternative. Basically what that means is anything is a least restrictive alternative to psychiatric hospitalization. So if you can come up with a safety plan, if you can have somebody go to an ENT or a crisis triage facility, if they can check in with their outpatient providers, be monitored by a loved one, family member, whoever that may be, those are all least restrictive alternatives. Jail diversion programs are that. The one thing that isn't a least restrictive alternative, though, is jail itself. So you can't say, well, I would have detained, but they're in jail, so they're safe, so I'm not going to. Jails are not considered least restrictive alternatives. Being in a place like a residential treatment facility or a voluntary place, it could still consider least restrictive alternative, but jail isn't one of those. So the examples here, like I talked about, ENT or crisis triage facilities, voluntary placement is a least restrictive alternative to detention. So if somebody is wanting to go and it's appropriate to go, then they can. Safety planning, jail diversions, or referral to outpatient services. So basically, like I said, the summed up way to say that is anything is a least restrictive alternative to psychiatric hospitalization.
Okay, what was the
CTF is crisis triage facility. Okay. So the evaluation for an ITA, a lot of times it's pretty thorough. There are frequent flyers that we see on a regular basis, and you could say, okay, well, we've seen them, we know this, but we still conduct evaluations for each person each time and going through a fairly, it's pretty listed out on what we need to look at. And so part of the evaluation when we do take place is a mental status. So we're checking that person's mood. We are looking at their affect, any thought process issues, whether that's illogical, hallucination, solutions, paranoia, We're looking at their rate and rhythm of speech, volume of tone, grooming, and hygiene. All of those things are taken into consideration. Those are things that we can see sometimes just at face value. And then, of course, suicidal thoughts. So when we are looking at ITA evaluation, the presence of suicidal thoughts is not enough for detention, right? So we go a little bit deeper into that because somebody can still have suicidal thoughts, but be active in treatment. The key factor in that is, do they have plan, intent, and means that they want to carry that out with? And so that's why we have that out there, the current thoughts, plans, intent, means, and history. Current thoughts are important because a couple times you'll get people who, it's situational based, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean that if, for example, if they don't get their SSI granted to them, or if they have a divorce, or if they don't pass a class, or something that's future based, then they're going to kill themselves. That's in the future. That doesn't mean we don't take it into consideration or don't take it seriously, but if it's not current and it's not related to right now and it's going to happen in the near future, that doesn't qualify. And so homicide is similar. There needs to be homicidal ideation, so some thoughts about hurting people due to that mental disorder or substance use disorder, and there has to be plans, intent, and means attached to that as well. If it's not due to a mental disorder or substance use disorder, that's typically a criminal issue. And then grade disability. So grade disability is a hard one to describe to community members, let alone other professionals. So the best way I could sum up grade disability on how that means, and there's a couple that we'll go through the definitions on here, but if I can give you an example, if somebody's up on the roof of the United Way and they want to jump off to hurt themselves, that would be SI. But if they're up on the roof to prove to us that they can all fly, that's grade disability, right? Or if somebody is refusing to eat because that's the only way they know they can lose weight, that's just poor choices, probably bad decision making. But if they're choosing not to eat or drink or sleep because aliens have poisoned our water supply and our food supply, and they're afraid to eat because they're going to end up dying, that's grade disability. So there has to be some component of, due to that mental disorder, due to that substance use disorder, that their thoughts are putting them at risk, or others at risk, that if nothing's done about it, their life or others will be in danger. So more of that IT evaluation continued. So in there, we're looking at a lot of different things. So we're looking at psychiatric diagnosis and history. If we can pull and get all relevant information on them and pull the history, there's a lot to that. So if it's somebody's first time, and it could be a first break, or if we know this person, they have a laundry list of history, we're going to take all that into consideration. So intellectual, developmental disabilities, taking that into consideration. They have physical illness, trauma, and abuse that we have to ask. Some of these are almost requirements just based on auditor stuff that we have to go through anyway, just to let alone just good evaluation. So we're taking criminal history into consideration, genetic and family effects. I won't just my PowerPoint you, but you can kind of see on here there's quite a bit that goes into history. We're looking at substance use history, volitional control, good faith voluntary status. That's one that we'll talk about a little bit later, but might as well get into it right now. So when we said presence of a least restrictive alternative, if somebody, and there is a least restrictive alternative available, we are supposed to try that by law, right? I have to prove in front of that judge and that defense and that prosecutor that I tried any and all least restrictive alternatives. And if I didn't, what was the reason why I did not? Was it appropriate? Was it not appropriate? Did they try a least restrictive alternative first and that option failed? Am I sending them home with somebody who's also under the influence? That's probably not the best safety plan. And so are we sending them home with somebody who's not their guardian, so on and so on. So we're looking at whether their good faith plan is actually going to work or works. And then volitional control, if we'll talk about it a little later, but that's a part that goes into it that kind of goes unnoticed sometimes. So, grade disability, I gave you my kind of example, but I'll give you the legit terminology and definition. This means a condition resulting from a mental disorder in which a person is in danger of serious critical harm, resulting from their failure to provide their own essential needs or health and safety due to RCW 7105, and B, manifest severe deterioration in routine functioning, evidenced by repeated and escalating loss of cognitive or volitional control over his or her actions, and is not receiving such care as essential to his or her health and safety. So I like my definition way better. So more terminology, this tends to drive loved ones a little bit crazy because everybody could result from hospitalization. At this point, in what's Thursday, I could benefit from hospitalization at this point. Put me in there for 3 days, give me some food, take care of me up, I'll be great. But it has to be due to imminence, right? That's the first one. And so imminence means that the state or condition of being likely to occur at any moment or near hand rather than distant or remote future. And so that's why I brought up the example of if it's conditional based to something in the near future. If it's going to be tied to that, we'll have to wait to see. And so we let, for example, that definition I gave on a SSI. So if their court hearing is coming up and we know what date that's coming on, we would then contact hopefully the attorney, contact the loved ones, and just say, hey, here's what's being reported, here's the court date, all these things verified, that's okay. Let us know how this goes, because if it goes bad, we want to be there to reevaluate it. If it goes well, then good, they got their money and they can go on their way. Right? So imminency is a key factor in that. There's also substantial adverse effects, and that means significant or considerable negative impact on an individual. So what that can mean is a couple different things. If, for example, we were sending them to an unlocked facility, and that person already has elopement issues, and that facility is where we would be sending them to. They have a history of eloping or different things in that situation. For example, we've had people who have abuse history with things like cuffs being involved. And so if that person has to go into protective custody, we need to know that that's going to have some substantial adverse effects on them for that. And so that can be things that would dictate what least restrictive alternative we do or which route we go. If sufficient environmental controls are in place, it means that a person is receiving or is likely to receive such care from responsible persons as is essential for the person's health, safety, and safety of others. This applies quite a bit to jail. If somebody's in jail, they're not going to get everything that they need if they're truly mentally ill or they're in a psychotic state. They're not going to get everything they need while they're in jail. Same applies to hospital stays if they're sitting at Cadillac on a single bed cert, and we'll explain a little bit more of what that means. It's hard to get the level of care that they'd be receiving at a psych hospital. So we take that into effect as well in our decision making. And then volitional functions. So it means the capacity to exercise restraint or direction over one's behavior, the ability to make conscious and deliberate decisions, and acting in accordance with one's reasoned decisions or choices. So the best way I could explain volitional functioning would be if these gentlemen in the back show up and they're law enforcement and I pull it together for them because I don't want to get arrested or beat up or whatever I think is going to happen, but then they leave. And then I act. I have volitional control because I can turn it on and off for who I want to. And so the ER can sometimes have a sobering effect on somebody that you remove them from where they were at, and then they behave in the ER for a little bit of time, and that's why we try to do it for extended, because are they pulling it together for the people that they need to pull it together for, but then they go back out to the community or go back out where they were at, and they're symptomatic again. You see this a lot in jail. And it doesn't mean that it's 100% malingering, but if somebody can hold it together in general population, but they can't hold it together in a PC pod and they can't hold it together downstairs, and they're using these things based on kind of where I want to sit and how I want to behave in one spot and then I'll behave good in another, they don't have volitional control. So the best way I can describe that is if somebody is psychotic, they're going to be psychotic if you have them in jail. They're going to be psychotic if you have them in the ER. They're going to be psychotic if you have them in services. If somebody is truly suicidal, it doesn't matter the situation. They're going to be suicidal where you put them at. And so volitional control meaning that they can't turn it on and off just because it pleases. So more terminology for that. We talked about imminency. The other one that we have is likelihood of serious harm. In the past, we had to go off a direct report, and we didn't tie in past history or collateral information, which we can now. And so likelihood of serious harm fits into that. So it means physical harm will be inflicted by an individual upon their own person, as evidenced by their threats or attempts to commit suicide or inflict physical harm on themselves. The physical harm will be inflicted by an individual upon another, as evidenced by behavior which has caused such harm or which places another individual or individuals in reasonable fear of sustaining such harm. Or physical harm will be inflicted by an individual upon the property of others, as evidenced by the behavior which has caused substantial loss or damage to the property, and the individual has threatened physical safety of another or has a history of one or more acts of violence. That's a long way of saying that we take in history. So if somebody showed a pattern of decompensation, hypothetically, they were detained 2 years ago. But when they got detained, they were manic and they started making inappropriate sexual comments, or they were making religious preoccupation kind of statements. And we know that when that happened, they decompensated to the point where they hurt themselves or hurt others, and so we detained. Now we are evaluating 2 years later, and they were doing fine, but now they're showing that same pattern. We can get ahead of that and do kind of a more of a preventative detention, because we know that when they acted like this in the past, that was what happened, so we can go ahead and get ahead of that. Where before, imminency means it's happening right now. So detention under ITA law, a patient cannot be detained without locating a psychiatric unit. And I think this is where another thing that for family and friends, as source of frustration, or even in the community, is yes, designated crisis responders have the ability to detain. They can't actually detain until a facility has accepted them, though. So that's a source of frustration, and it takes a long time. And so that's the other thing that people, when you have these individuals, and they're covering everywhere, they're covering schools, hospitals, jails, they're getting from point A to point B, they're evaluating somebody in the ER, this stuff all takes time, but then locating and trying to find a spot to take them can't take some time, because we don't control whether a facility will accept, we don't control how long that facility takes to get back to us, whether they've accepted or not, what labs they want. Sometimes they want blood and urine, other times they want EKGs, so on and so on. So this process can take a while, and we don't dictate when they take them, how they take them. So that's a sense of contention, especially for some of my DCRs. And then a custody authorization. You hear CA. It used to be called DNT, detain and transport. A custody authorization is what we would use to get them from point A to point B. So, for example, if somebody's acting up in the community, I could issue a custody authorization for local law enforcement to temporarily put them in protective custody and transport them from the community to an ER where I can do the evaluation. You can do that to an ENT facility as well, but it gives them temporary. It doesn't mean they're detained. So if you hear that there was a custody authorization, that doesn't mean somebody's detained. That means that they're getting an ITA evaluation. That would, I would put them from point A to point B is to conduct the ITA evaluation, not because they're detained. So that's the other thing that sometimes hospitals get upset about. They're like, this person's already detained. I got the custody authorization right here. Like, no, that's not a detention. That just means you have to come evaluate. They still think that that means that they're detained and then go hands-on. It doesn't give them any more rights than what they would already have. So, see, that's where single bed certs come into play. And I'll clarify here, not everybody has the ability to single bed cert. So what a single bed cert is if I have gone through my laundry list of people who, in hospitals, ENT facilities, crisis triage facilities, whoever could possibly take this person, and I get turned down by everybody. Rather than having to do a no bed report and straight the person against my best wishes, I can put them into the medical hospital. And so for us, the only hospital who will do that is Cadillac Medical Center. So not the freestanding ER, but Cadillac Medical Center. But not a lot of people have that luxury. Granted, we have one. Some people don't have single bed cert at all. We might as well talk about the no bed report as well. We try, and I'm sure everybody else would probably speak for all designated crisis responders or crisis providers, we try our hardest to not do that. We will beg and plead with the ERs to admit the person or trump up some reason for observation, because if it's what we are considering detention, the last thing we want to do is say, hey, we thought that you should be detained because you're a danger to yourself, but best of luck. You know, that's, I don't think anybody wants that. So we try to get really creative, try to get cute in that manner to find a reason to observe them or admit them for some reason so we can find better placement. And if that is the case, there's actually a form that gets sent back to the state. It's a pretty laundry list of all the facilities you called, the reason why they denied, who you talked to, all that kind of stuff. So typically, psychiatric inpatient units require medical clearance. They don't always have to, but it is very typical that they do. The problem with that is that reinforces the myth that they have to be at a hospital to get evaluated. which is not the case. We can do that evaluation anywhere. It can be in the person's home if it's safe to do so, and we have access to other staff. We can do that at schools. We can do that in jail. We can do it wherever. They don't have to be taken to the ER just to get that. Majority of our evaluations are actually done in-house at Works Health Crisis Services. So we do majority of those in-house, and detained patients require secure transport either by ambulance or by police, and those are the two definitions of secure transport. So if somebody is detained, they won't have to be. The facility can't accept them in somebody's car or show them a taxi. If they need to be detained, it has to be secure transport. And so once detained, they are held involuntarily for 72 judicial hours, which is, that's really hard to say with one of those judicial. Yeah, sorry. What that basically means is weekends and holidays don't count. So if somebody is in there and they got detained on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday don't count, and Monday is a holiday, Monday doesn't count. So they'll be named for that initial for 72. After that, they'll go to a 14-day court hearing, and the judge will hear from both sides, patient, treatment team, and they'll make that decision on if the patient needs to stay a little bit longer. So the SUD can only go, so SUD can only, I think that's kind of worded weird, but if it's a substance use disorder, I can use a psych hospital for a substance use disorder, but I cannot send somebody with a mental disorder or a mental illness without drugs and alcohol to a secure detox facility. So the problem with some of that is some of the secure detox facilities are unable to manage really acute cases or violent cases or things that require seclusion and restraint. So we're not using those. We put them in more of the mental health system by giving them both co-occurring, which means they are always doing already anyway, but it doesn't go both ways. So SUD can go to psych, but psych can't go just to SUD, if that makes sense. So special circumstances. In the past, before Joel's Law, this was a DCR's evaluation was kind of a final word. You could request another evaluation, and we would come out and do a separate one or send a different evaluator to do that. But Joel's Law gives family members or loved ones an appeal process. And so what that means is if a DCR has evaluated somebody and they have chosen not to detain for whatever reason, that family or those loved ones still think that the person should be detained, they can do a fact-to statement, which is basically a witness statement, is the layman term for that. And they can turn that into the court. There's packets that you pick them up at Crisis. Somebody else made from a different one has, but we have them at Crisis. They can also download them. They will turn that into the judge, and then the judge will make a request for our records. So they will take the family's report, they will take our records, compare the two, and then make an independent decision on whether the person is going to be detained or not. So if law enforcement gets a Joel's Law thing, it's written way different than what a normal detention will. I mean, it gives you shall apprehend, you can use up to a certain amount of force, so on and so on. It's very detailed for law enforcement, but there's no wiggle room. Once the judge says Joel's Law is good, we get the order, we give it to law enforcement, it's a done deal. And the judge can then order the initial 72, but then again, the process stays as usual, that most of them will live before. So LRAs, we talked about having dual purpose for LRA. One is least restrictive alternative to anything but psychiatric hospitalization. The other one is a least restrictive alternative. And so you hear all the time, well, the person's on an LRA, they're on an LRA. What does that mean? So if a person's on an LRA, that's what that means for court order. So it's a court order to participate in outpatient services. The best way I can describe that is kind of like being on mental health probation. So it's not meant to be punitive, but it's meant to be kind of a set criteria of things that are required for the patient to do to stay out of the hospital. It's condition-based. So treatment team usually consists of a case manager and a med provider. Those are the bare minimum. That doesn't mean they can't have more services. That's just the two that would be guaranteed. They need to have somebody monitoring, which is typically what the case manager does, and then the meds with whatever med provider, that could be an ARMP, psychiatrist, med nurse, whatever that may be. The treatment team can request the LRA be revoked, but that does not mean that the LRA will be revoked, because sometimes if it's punitive in nature, and so I can give you an example, if somebody was going to their appointments, taking their meds as prescribed, but they were smoking joints when the case manager showed up, or drinking alcohol when the case manager showed up, Part of the stipulations in that LRA would be that they're going to refrain from using drugs or alcohol, refrain from cannabis, so on and so on. But if the person isn't decompensating or doesn't need to be detained on a regular basis, you wouldn't take their rights away and put them back in the hospital because it's not meant to be punitive. So in all reality, you could, if that person hypothetically was not going to the appointments, not taking their meds, and on top of that, using drugs and alcohol, that's different. But it's not meant to punish people. It's not meant to be punitive in nature. It's used to give them kind of a set guideline of what they should be doing to stay in the hospital and be compliant with treatment. And if there's any source of decompensation from that, then we would revoke that LRA. So only a DCR can revoke the LRA and send that person back to the hospital. And like I put in there, decompensation is often required. It doesn't have to be, but like I said, we like it to be a reason why you're putting them back in the hospital, not just to punish them and wait to figure out. So LRAs are either 90 or 180 days with the option to renew. So we have people who have been on LRA for years because without the LRA, they wouldn't be staying well and doing well, and that gives them an extra layer. So some people do really well on the LRA and don't need it any longer. They don't have to stay on it. So it does have the option to renew after that 90 or 180 days is over. So limitations for placement. We cannot detain anyone under the age of 13. So that's kind of the magic number for age of consent, all that other stuff. But if they are under the age of 13, they cannot be detained by a DCR. That doesn't mean that we wipe our hands of the situation. That means that we can help, maybe find and help with parent initiated as an option. We can help with voluntary placement. I've never liked telling a parent who has a suicidal kid to, here's a number, just call. You guys can figure it out. With anybody have kids here know it's just stressful just having kids, period, let alone all of life stressors. And on top of that, now your kid's wanting to harm themselves, and I have to call and navigate a system I've never even heard of before. So we do help with that process. We will make the calls for them. We will advocate for them, tell them, yes, we agree with this. They did get evaluated. We think they should be detained. We'll help them through that process, but we can't guarantee that they will either get into the psych hospital. And sometimes parents have to go here from the Tri-Cities to Spokane or here from Seattle just on an attempt to get that done. There are no, to my knowledge, specific Alzheimer's and dementia units specifically designed for that, and no facilities that are specifically for autism or developmental disabilities. So that is also a difficult population to place, and I'll explain a little bit why. So typically, if we're going to place somebody in a psychiatric hospital, there should be some therapeutic benefit from that. So if you are in a manic state, we can give you mood stabilizers, assess your safety level, and hopefully you get back down to where you're at. If you're severely depressed, hopefully give some medication to lessen those symptoms, so on and so on with psychotic symptoms. If we can give you antipsychotics and you can become less symptomatic or not symptomatic at all, that's great. You can't give somebody who is nonverbal, violent, autistic meds to make them nonverbal, or make them verbal, make them nonviolent and less autistic, right? So same thing with dementia, Alzheimer's. You can't give somebody psychiatric medication to make them less of having the organic brain disorder. Now, that doesn't mean what I'm saying is that we don't detain people with autism or people with developmental disabilities. You detain based on the criteria. So it isn't, if somebody is developmentally disabled and they're actively trying to hurt themselves and kill themselves, that's what you're paying attention to is the criteria, not the diagnosis, right? So there's just not specialized units to place that population to get the care they need. Instead, they would be just with the general population that we already have. There are very few secure detox facilities that can manage acute and aggressive behaviors. Some facilities have a waiver to not do seclusion and restraint, which means that they aren't useful for the population we'd be trying to give them. And just a little fun fact is 9.1 inpatient psychiatric beds per 100,000 people, which ranks Washington 46th out of 50 states in capacity for inpatient beds. So we have very, very limited beds. I don't know if that statistic is still 46. But yeah, so there's only 4 states that are less than us. So that's not a good thing, but it's faced with some of these challenges. It speaks to what we're talking about, is that sometimes the people that need specific beds and specific resources to that population are unavailable or don't exist. All right, so I will then take the rest of my time to talk about the specific basic services that we have here in the Tri-Cities for both Benton and Franklin County. So, building on the crisis services that we have. So, we have wards for inpatient unit, and we have transitions, which is a crisis triage facility. We do not have a detox, social detox, secure detox, medical detox here locally. Some talks and good talks in the work for getting something like that, but at this time we do not have that. So most of our things either go to the crisis triage facility here locally or the psych hospital. We do have some specialized services that have expanded from crisis services. And one of those that you may have heard is the True Blood program. So we have a mobile outreach team. So this is specifically to get ahead of people who are out in the community and potentially committed crimes to reduce that recidivism rate. You're hearing more and more that the jail is the catch-all for that, and they don't turn people away and can't turn people away. But a lot of people are committing crimes that are more nuisance crimes, like trespass, disorderly conduct, things that are non-violent, non-high. They're landing in jail and waiting there. And so historically, they would wait in jail for their competency restoration services, that 1077 order, and they would be behind the statutory guidelines for that. And so the state then put some of these dollars into getting ahead of that to help solve that problem. So what we did is we made a mobile outreach team that employs both DCRs and bachelor level mobile outreach counselors to ride along with the law enforcement entities of Benton and Franklin County. So we have DCRs in Kennewick, Richland, and Pasco that ride in tandem and respond on scene. We also have people that do the swing shift, and we have one DCR doing the grave and one DCR doing the weekend. So we pretty much have close to 24-hour coverage for that. The point of that, in addition to cutting down our recidivism rate, is it streamlines a lot of stuff. In the past, law enforcement would see somebody, they would something would kind of click that red flag that there's a problem here. It's something to do with substance use or mental disorder, and they would then take them to the ER. That person would get some food, get a shot from the doctor, hang around a little bit, and by the time the DCR gets there, they're seeing a completely different picture than what law enforcement just saw 2 hours ago, right? So when we have the DCRs responding in tandem, they're seeing the exact same picture what the police are. And they're also starting the process right there. They're already starting the evaluation process. They're already making phone calls. They're already doing everything that they need to do, and the DA is almost all the time in placement. So it's streamlined quite a little bit and taken some of the burden off of law enforcement that they don't have to be both social workers and law enforcement. They can kind of rely on placement to get that going. What we have found out, though, is law enforcement is great at de-escalating already. So the two worlds have blended nicely, and we have picked up on our second grant cycle. So that program is funded from now until June 2021. In addition to the mobile outreach team, we have our prosecutorial diversion program. And so that is the complement to mental health court. So it's not a competing service. Those of you that have heard about mental health court or have clients that are in mental health court, they are serving those individuals who have been found competent, where PDP serves those individuals who are found incompetent or competency has been raised. And so that's another layer that we can kind of get somebody out of jail, get their charges spent without prejudice, meaning that it's not a get out of jail free card. If they participate in the program, they do everything they're supposed to do, get hooked up with services, get out, live healthy lives, those charges they'll be gone. If they don't, those charges can be refiled and they can get back, either get a sentence or get a thing in the mail, whatever it is that they will do. But it's a great program because we're adding a layer of intensity to case management, very similar to the PACT program. So those of you that heard of PACT, for more of our chronic individuals who need a higher level of community support, rather than just 1 or 2 a week, these people are spending 3 times, 4 times every day with the person inside their home, getting them whatever that is. So housing, food needs, all those wonderful stuff. We also have jail services where we have an MHP, 2 MHPs, I should say, in Benton County. So those individuals are another layer if somebody slipped through the cracks or had been in jail and was fine before, but now they showed signs of decompensating. We can be there to assess that, start that parole process, and make some observation status requirements. So if somebody, or recommendations, if somebody is needing to be on continuous watch, they need to be on 15, 30 minute, maybe we can get a furlough order get that person from the jail over to a hospital for medical, or get them to a psych hospital for mental health, get them stabilized, they come back to jail, finish out what they need to do. And that is it for me. I think my time is almost
Yeah,
up.
but you want to talk, a couple of things, a little bit about the staffing patterns and qualifications at Crisis and what that looks like. And another part of the True Blood grant that we just came from the CIT, how that relates to it and what we're doing with that.
Sure. So staffing, we have DCRs, and those typically we staff up to call volume. And so we get a lot more calls and requests for evaluations during the day shift because that's when services are available, that's when providers are there. And so we typically have 1 to 3 DCRs on shift Monday through Friday day, and anywhere from 1 to 2 on swing. Grade is a little bit different because the call volume isn't that high on grade shift, so we run minimum with 1 DCR, 1 crisis counselor on grade, and weekends is similar to. The DCRs are all master level. They have to be MHPs. How many social workers do I have in the crowd? You MSW elitists, you're automatically MHPs when you get out of school. So
you have to apply for it now. So.
Oh, just to apply, huh?
Well, you got to submit the paperwork showing that you took the stuff and wait for the process. It's the same process as someone who's not. You have to submit the same stuff.
Just without the 2 years of master level experience. Yeah. So if you're thinking about from a bachelor's, there's a lot of reasons to go MSW, and that's one of them. You're automatically MHP. You just fill out the paperwork. Poor Jamie, fill out the paperwork. But you didn't have to have 2 years of that own experience. So you have to be an MHP in order to be PR, and that is master level. And then we do employ bachelor levels, which they probably go by different names depending on where you're at. We employ crisis counselors, and they conduct the evaluations in a similar way. The only difference in what they do is they don't have the ability to do the detention. They still conduct their evaluations, they still go off the same RCWs, they don't do anything different other than they handle more of the low acuity schools, stuff like that, that we know maybe is more of an outreach. It's not, I think people forget that we do more than just ITA evaluations. We do more than just placement. We're doing kind of acute situations that come up, schools, different things that happen. So we will send the bachelor level people out to handle some of those. And then crisis intervention team training. So Gordon and I both just came from that to here. So our teams, both crisis, PDP, and True Blood, participate in the 40-hour crisis intervention team training for law enforcement. So we are co-facilitators of that. We help in the scenarios. We do some of the consumer panels. We present on a bunch of different things from mental health, drugs and alcohol, go through de-escalation techniques and sets. And so all of our crisis services, we had 1 on September a year, which is the 40-hour. We've expanded that to 2, which we now have 1 in February. So from here on out, we will have 2 40 hours, 1 in February and 1 in September. And we will be pretty much the ones helping out with the bulk of those. Any other questions before?
Yeah, on the, and I mean, this applies to everyone, the 9.1 beds per 100,000 people. Is that youth and adult beds?
I don't know if that's separate. I would say it's probably total. Yeah. Yes, please.
So there's a mental health institution that's proposed at the University of Washington. Is that going to have an effect on the total number of beds?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I would hope so. What, do you know the name of the facility?
It's part of the hospital.
Not offhand, but there's been a lot of push for communities because our state hospitals are so overfilled, and with communities opening local hospitals for the longer term commitment, there's been a significant push for that to happen. Communities to take on more of that role for long-term placement for the 90 commitment. I don't know what that one is.
Any other questions on ITA or specific to or some crisis services? Well,
Cameron. So you mentioned that an individual that's used paid for SUV, like hospital. So is there like a certain EAC level that they have to go to that for anybody?
so that's a good question. So there is no BA level for us to assess, but there is BA level specific to the facility. And so typically it's not across the board. So there isn't like a 300 and below that goes to the hospital. It's facility specific. So each facility has their ability to create whatever they do to the level of care. Some people, Virginia Mason, more of a medical site, they may have something a little bit different where a place like Transitions is not licensed for detox, so they can't do CMOP protocol, they can't do a bunch of other stuff, so they may have a different level of PAL level or opiate, benzo type of stuff. So it's going to be facility specific on what that criteria is.
And the other question is, I mentioned LRAs, so is that for both mental health and substance use or no?
Yeah, and it's for both, but it kind of muddies the water when you do both, because if hypothetically I detain somebody to ABHS and they get released on an LRA out of there, but yet they're already currently on an LRA from Yakima, who's the one monitoring that LRA then? Is it the outpatient provider monitoring both? Is it the substance use provider and the mental health? So you can have two LRAs, two separate. We would try to talk to the facility and just give the one or whoever's managing it. But yeah, so it is a possibility to have both or one or the other.
Question in regards to kind of on to Mr. Can you look into the microphone? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that's
Yeah, I guess, the question is relating to the LOA, I guess. So if you said that you can have both mental health and SUD, or you can have both, and that's one. So what happens in a situation of co-occurring then? Which one did you go for, I guess?
Yeah, that would be up to the treatment team, and we would stick to that criteria. And so if the person was drunk and suicidal, then it wouldn't matter. We're going to the LRA and sending them back. But it could be based on the substance. So it's because due to their substance use, we'd probably be sending them back then to the substance use disorder facility or secure detox that released them. So it would be situational. You guys?
Yeah, I have a question about the, this is go over the single bed certification.
Yeah, so a single bed cert is last resort, and so the hospital itself can have the ability to decide whether they can provide that care, because it's very specific in what they're supposed to, and basically they're held to the same standard we held to. So they're supposed to be providing the level of care in the ER or upstairs that they admitted to what they be receiving inside the hospital. We don't think that's very hard to do for any, and it's almost unreasonable to expect that a medical hospital would be able to do that. But that is what happened. So we would try any and all facilities, and then when we got the no, then we would then fill out our single bed cert form, and we talk to the PCC, and the PCC decides whether they can or cannot accept that person, and then they will remain at the medical hospital until we find placement. If placement doesn't happen within that 72 hours, they will have their court hearing done at the hospital itself.
And I can add to that a little bit. So single bed certs didn't always exist. They were started about 10 years ago, and they were born out of that stat that Cameron shared with you, the lack of psychiatric beds locally. And so essentially what the state did to solve that problem, because we didn't have enough psychiatric facilities, to say, we as a state, if you as a hospital are willing to attest to be able to provide this care, we are going to certify one single bed within your hospital to provide psychiatric care under the IPA law. And so I think that's the challenge with hospitals, is they're essentially saying, and they loosened up slightly, but they're still essentially saying, we're going to meet all these requirements for psychiatric care for somebody that's detained. And that's why, right now, Cadillac's the only one in our region that's willing to do so.
Thanks, Gordon. All right, I'll turn it over to Luca.
good afternoon. I'm Anita Warren. I am the CEO for Blue Mountain Counseling of Columbia County.
And Christensen, I'm the clinical director.
And we are the only providers for Columbia County, and therefore we do all the crisis services. We have a unique situation as we have what we call first responders. And we are the ones, I'm one of them, we go out first to see if we can handle the call, de-escalate it, get the person to do a safety plan or whatever, so that maybe we don't have to call the DCR, because we only have 3 DCRs in our facility. So we try to make it a little easy on them. But that doesn't always work, as we're all well aware. And when that doesn't, we call the DCRs in to do their evaluations to see what needs to be done. And surprisingly, a lot of times when you bring that second person in, boy, that person all of a sudden is like, oh yeah, I'm really not wanting to do this. Because it's like we gang up on them. They don't like that. So I will turn it over to Suzanne to discuss what we do.
So, like Tamina said, we're a small agency, 10 staff. So we're therapists by day, we're DCRs by day, and by night, by weekend. So we have to be creative. And that's where the first responders have really been helpful, because I don't have to cancel my whole clientele for the day to go deal with someone, it might be minor. So we do have 3 DCRs and about 5 first responders, and we are responsible for Dayton, Starbuck, and occasionally people drive from neighboring counties because we have a hospital. We have also had to be creative in coming up with a contract with our local hospital for crisis respite, which is mostly successful. We also have to staff that too, so it does not take the burden off of our office. But it has prevented a lot of hospitalization, and we prefer to put 13 on us in that, and to keep it really short term because it is labor intensive.
As Suzanne said, we do crisis stabilization, and a lot of times, and that takes one of our staff, so that means that maybe a staff person is there from midnight to 6 a.m. until 10 or 11, and in the meantime, the DCRs may be trying to still find a placement. Usually when we go to respite, it's because they can't find a bed. And as we, again, are all well aware, that is one of the hardest things we have to do. There's times we find no bed, no place to put them. So we will put them into a respite, and we work with our local hospital to do that. And it takes our staff, and again, we do the crisis as part of our day and night job. And sometimes we do look a little ragged when we come to work and all night long. I've been known to have to do respite and then come in for audits and try to file half complete. But we have a fairly good working relationship with our local law enforcement. They pick them up, they take them to the ER for us. They call us to say we're taking them there. Fairly good in the hospital. Sometimes they call us before the patient is there. We explain, call us when the patient gets there, please. We don't want to come and sit and wait for them. But like I say, we do it all. We do pretty much the same thing that Lord was explaining. We follow the same rules and regulations.
Have you seen a lot more ICAs in recent past, or what is the trend of those?
I hate to jinx it because things have been relatively quiet lately. So far this year, I think we're probably down a little bit, but I don't know how many we do a year.
Generally, a year, we do probably between 16 and 20. We had 1 month last year, February, don't want to jinx it, just about killed us. We had 4 ITAs in 1 week. Yeah, so that just about did us in, because you got staff, DCRs are trying to do that, they can't see their clients, first responders who are trying to respond. We're doing respite for periods. We didn't even know who was coming and going some days. We were like, oh, you're here today, okay. So, yeah, we have those periods where it is just crazy. Then we go through long periods where, luckily, they maybe have a crisis period during our work hours. And then a first responder kind of try to work with them, maybe go talk to the DCR about what to do. But we don't have quite the volume that like Lawrence does. So, yeah. And yes, Joe.
So, kind of along the same lines as Carol, so how many, what percentage of individuals that the first responder sees, say, end up in the crisis? So you do the first responder does the initial.
There's in crisis, but probably 50%, we end up having to call a DCR. We try not to, but sometimes the person just will not cooperate. They want to just do somebody in, they want to do themselves and whatever. And so we end up having to call the DCR in. Yeah.
I think additionally, though, we respond to any and all calls. So really, there's a fair amount that are not what you would consider crisis, but we're a small town. We're trying to keep those community connections, and we're trying to respond. We're trying to diminish the thought that, you know, I'd rather go out now than at 2 a.m. So some of them we can cut off pretty easy because they're really not ever going to meet criteria, but we're just trying to get that.
I have another question, I'm sorry, because you guys do represent a really rural community. I was wondering what the profile of your average client might look like, or if it's just all over the board.
To be real honest, it is all over the board. Recently, we had a 10-year-old. We've had them all the way up to in their 70s, 80s with dementia. And as Lord says, we can't really detain them. And the community gets very, very upset with us. What do you mean you can't? He tried to hit his wife. There's an issue here that is not something that will ever be cured. But yeah, we've done it all the way from 10 right on up through geriatric. Yeah. And there's no like, but the majority of them are probably, your 20 to 50-year-olds. They're in here. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Your first responders, what's their educational or training background? Oh.
Well, I'll take mine. Truthfully, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've worked in the behavioral health field that long, but anybody that comes on that doesn't meet the criteria as a master, they go through training with Chris Ann. We then put them on a schedule. They are a backup first responder, or we try to take them out on any crisis that happens to give them actual hands-on training. Then they get that for generally 2 or 3 weeks, and we flip it, and they become the primary first responder with a backup first responder. But there's always a DCR also on the schedule. And then once they feel they're comfortable and Chrisanne feels comfortable, we let them be a primary first responder just with the DCR. But they have to go through crisis training. But we have some that maybe they only have a high school diploma. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're a little ahead of schedule, it looks like, and we do have a break coming up. I just wanted to touch on a couple things real quick. Didn't mention earlier, we did bring this handout if people saw that when they came in. It does show the different regions across the state. It does show the Greater Columbia region. Kind of take for granted that there's 9 counties. We're out there every year, like within the last year. I've been to all of these crisis agencies as part of an auditing process. We've been there, but kind of realized that one of them might not be as familiar with the different counties. Lawrence County, Lawrence with Cameron's presentation, they're here in Benton, Franklin counties. We just got the presentation from Blue Mountain with Demita and Chris Sand. They're representing Columbia County. And then just as it continues, we'll have comprehensive healthcare. They represent and are providing crisis services in Yakima County, in Kittitas County, and in Walla Walla County. We also have Palouse River Counseling on our schedule. They provide services in Whitman County, and then Garfield and Asotin County that provided us crisis services there are provided by Quality Behavioral Health. So just as a bit of an update on that, that's kind of how the region looks and the different crisis responders and crisis providers we have in those different regions. And also just to touch really quickly on a comment that had been made earlier about hospital beds and availability. There's continuous movement on trying to create more beds. We'll continue to hear proposals about funding and with the legislature, with the goal, because I think everyone acknowledges we don't have enough community behavioral health beds in this state, which is why we have single bed cert. As Gordon was explaining, the single bed cert problem is significantly higher on the west side of the state. You know, we routinely hear about, you know, a place like Harborview potentially having a dozen people on a single bed cert at any one time, if not more. It is an issue across the state. Another thing that has happened over the last few years is the shift of the state hospitals, Western State Hospital on the west side, Eastern State Hospital on the east side. Their ability to treat civil commitments, which is this process that we've talked about with the ITAs, has been reduced somewhat over time. The amount of beds they have dedicated to those civil patients is just less than it was. Some of that's due to staffing and safety issues. But the other driving force behind that is there's a big effort being made to do forensic evaluations, forensic competency restorations in a more timely manner. The state has had lawsuits filed in the past about that. That is one of the things that resulted in the True Blood funding that Cameron was also referencing earlier, is, you know, being able to have the state hospital be able to more quickly do those forensic evaluations and competencies. Sometimes one of the things that can slow that process down is once someone's on a forensic unit, it turns out they need to be flipped over to the civil commitment. That forensic process has gone through. They still would meet the criteria for a civil commitment, and they get flipped over to the civil side. So trying to do that more quickly reduces access for our providers and the hospitals to transfer people into long-term care. It can take longer. The plan for the state at this time is to have significantly more community hospitals that can take long-term bed transfers. So the types of transfers historically that have gone to Western State Hospital or Eastern State Hospital from our community hospitals, the idea is to have private facilities that can provide that level of care. There was a pretty big push a couple of years ago to fund a lot of beds like that. The funding didn't quite go through, so they weren't able to fund like capital to actually build these units. So instead it kind of shifted from trying to convince places that already had beds, maybe regional hospitals that weren't using all of their beds, trying to shift them into operating these beds into this. And that process began in 2018. And at this point we have 33 long-term community beds across the entire state. Actually, the majority of them actually exist within our region because Virginia Mason Memorial in Yakima and Astria Hospital in Toppenish both do have some long-term beds. But we have 33 currently. I've heard recently that there are about that many are supposed to be opening up by maybe the end of the summer this year. But the long-term goal of that is hundreds of beds, not 33. It's not in the 60s. And to replace all the civil commitment beds that we've had historically at Western State Hospital and Eastern State Hospital, we would be looking more at trying to come up with about 1,000 beds if we were ever to move completely away from civil commitments at those state hospitals, which is one of the things that has been proposed. Currently, Western State Hospital, we've heard, is admitting almost no civil commitments since the beginning of the year. Maybe a handful, they're tending to flip forensic cases over into those civil beds, which doesn't have an avenue then for people to be transferred, which lends to longer length of stay in the community hospital, because in the past, as soon as someone went on a 90-day they might be referred to Eastern. You might be in a hospital like Lord's Counseling Center here in Richland for 20 days. If someone needs longer-term care than that, pretty quickly they would be referred once they get on that 90-day LRA commitment inpatient, maybe within a couple days, and you're looking at a 20-day hospitalization that goes from an initial detention to a 40-day extension to a 90-day commitment to a transfer into a state hospital. And as that has changed, that process just slows down, and in some places it isn't an option, which leads to the community hospital continuing to treat the person for as long as it may take to get them to a point where they are stable for discharge, and that could be significantly longer. That does tax those systems. It creates less bed availability in the short term, creates increased costs for places like us at the ASO, as well as the MCOs that are managing the Medicaid funds, because we don't normally pay for state hospital beds. They're paid for through a separate thing with the state. So if we pay for someone to be in a community hospital for 40 days, because it's taking 20 days longer to get to long-term care, that's an extra 20 days of inpatient costs that maybe 5 years ago we would not be looking to pay, because that transfer would have already happened. So, there's a lot of talks there looking at increasing funding in the legislature. That's an ongoing thing. There's talk of building a new Western State Hospital. The challenge with Western is that they are no longer certified by the Joint Commission, so they're no longer able to bill Medicare, which is a huge cost problem. A lot of people at Western have Medicare, and if you can't bill Medicare for those inpatient days, those all come out of state-only funds. So there's a lot of potential solutions people are working on. All of those processes are slow, but they all add up to increasing beds in the state, and it's a process that gets more and more attention, and we hope to get there. It's just a difficult transition as we, hopefully 5 years from now, will have a significantly more bed capacity. But all of that stuff takes time, and it takes money and fund. The general feedback people tend to hear is that it's just not financially feasible to build a psychiatric facility and then continue to be able to operate based on the reimbursement. But if they can get help building the facility through, which is what's happened at times in the past, through funding from the state, then they might be able to then operate the facility. And so a lot of it comes into potential funding for capital improvements, where they can actually build a new facility, and then just be tasked with operating it, and not try to also operate at a level where they're trying to pay back all the costs that they had for starting it. So those are some of the challenges related to the inpatient hospital stuff. Just wanted to go back to that. And I think we'll be at a break point. And one other thing to point out for the rest of the presentations is people do have questions. It looks like it would be easier if people would raise their hand, and then a mic can get over to them, so that then the entire question can be heard. So that we do have people on the phone. That way they can make out all of the question, or we won't have the presenters restating the question as much. Does that sound like?
Yes, thank you.
So for future questions, hand raise, get a mic to, and then we can go ahead and ask the question. So I think we're on pace now for a break. I think we had it for 15 minutes at 2:35 coming back. So that's 15, almost 20. So we'll go ahead and take a break now, and we'll be back in a little while. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, how are you? I'm good. How are you doing?
It's just water.
Yeah. We got a one-on-one with her.
Yeah, I would like to. How do we get there?
I know. So I have 8 when I have 3 grants. You know, forever before they figured it all out. It's okay to my daughter. Oh, yeah, like, it'll be nice to see how
Ready to get started? Oh, we have to like,
Oh, yep.
Okay, if people could start to make their way back to their.
Well, nice catching up with you.
Well, thank you. You rock. Thanks.
Okay, so we are going to get going here again. Go ahead and bring up Courtney Esla from Comprehensive Healthcare.
Hang on, let me. Okay, working? All right, let me get this out of the way.
My name is Courtney Hessler, I'm with Comprehensive Healthcare, and I'm just have a few slides just to help guide the conversation related to our crisis services. So, as mentioned earlier, we provide services in a few different counties, so just to give you some information on the counties, Yakima, we're sitting on about 4,300 square miles, and this includes the Yakima Indian Reservation, and it's one of the largest counties in the state, so we have quite the geography to cover when it comes to crisis response. Walla Walla County, about 1,300 square miles, also includes the Umatilla Indian Reservation, one of the fastest growing counties, actually. Kittitas County, 2,300 square miles. I also included Klickitat County. It's now part of the Southwest region, but for a very long time, it was part of the Greater Columbia region. So when we look at just Yakima County, to give you an idea of how we deploy crisis response, we have 7 designated crisis responders, DCRs, that do the 24/7 coverage of the county. We also have another DCR that's located specifically in the lower valleys of the area so that they can provide response Monday through Friday and help us have a quicker response time. We also have 6 DCRs embedded with law enforcement. So 3 or so years ago, we were also awarded some True Blood grant funds to do this. So they are deployed with the Yakima Police Department, Yakima Sheriff's Office, and the Union Gap Police Department. Also within our crisis services, we have 4 crisis managers that assist the 7 DCRs with triaging, answering the phones, doing some of that initial contact and screening. Yakima County also houses 2 adult evaluation and treatment units, so psychiatric hospitals, basically. One is called Bridges, the other one is called SELA ENT. SELA. We also have 1 youth ENT called Two Rivers Landing, located in Yakima. We have a crisis triage center. Actually, it was the first crisis triage center established in the state of Washington. It provides both crisis stabilization beds and subacute detox. So it's not a secure or locked detox. Anyone can self-refer to that detox. And we use the beds within that crisis triage center interchangeably, so either detox or crisis stabilization. Walla Walla County has a similar makeup, 7 DCRs for the 24/7 response, also a crisis case manager. They also have Waypoint, which is a crisis stabilization unit, but also has residential beds. So these beds are for individuals who need a longer-term treatment, so usually 6 months or so is what our program targets to help people transition, usually from the state hospital or an ENT back into the community. In Kittitas County, it's much like Blue Mountain. The therapists work as crisis responders after hours and on the weekends, so they have a rotation that they go through. So just to give you some quick idea of data, in 2019, we had over 25,000 calls with all of our counties for what we call a request for outreach. And that 25,000 doesn't really include the calls that come in through our crisis line, where the case manager was able to help maybe provide a resource, a referral, connect them to their treatment team. But the 25,000 is what we encountered as a crisis service. In 2019, we did 674 ITA detentions, mental health ITA detentions, and then another 100 SUD ITA detentions. Someone had asked a question earlier about increase in detentions. Recently, the ASO pulled some data for our region, very helpful to look at that. So since January 2018, Greater Columbia region as a whole has had an increase in mental health ITAs at 29%. Those are initial ITAs. When we look at the LRA revocations, which Cameron talked about earlier, that was an increase of 68%. So in general, with our crisis services, again, our goal is to outreach and resolve it in the least restrictive way possible. So this could mean placing someone in a crisis stabilization bed. It could mean returning someone home with a safety plan.
You're my guys.
Am I safe? Is that any better? So, okay. Safety planning, return home, crisis stabilization, detox placement. We try to find different things to do besides hospitalize. That's the last thing that we want to do because it does remove someone's rights. So that's always kind of been our goal and mission. Crisis case managers are extremely helpful to go and do a lot of that triage work, a lot of that frontline, getting information and try to help conceptualize the case for the DCR, especially when you have DCRs traveling thousands of miles geography-wise. We have to be very creative in how we deploy those services. Crisis stabilization beds historically have been very significant for our counties in reducing our hospitalizations. Our average length of stay prior to integration was about 3 to 4 days, maybe 3 to 5 days, because we had the ability to keep someone in our facility for as long as felt was necessary, for up to 14 days, to help initiate medications, get them hooked up with resources, primary care, things like that. But that changed with integration. Now we have to go through an authorization process. The MCOs provide us with 3-day authorization. So that has reduced our average length of stay overall. Also, our approach is to respond where the crisis is occurring. So it's at the school, it's at the hospital, it's at the jail, it's wherever in the community that we can go. We try not to defer or send people to the ER. We like to resolve it in the community as much as possible because the majority of the people we see aren't detained. Can't think of anything else, so I'm questions.
So I have a question about the increase in the ITAs and the LRA revocation. Do you think, well, first off, it's kind of a two-part question. Is that an increase similar to what's going on around the state, or is that kind of unique to you?
Well, that took into account the whole region, so everything that you saw on that map, that's also.
I guess as far as the trend goes.
It's been trending, it's always been trending upwards for years and years and years. A lot of that could be attributed to increase in substance use that we see. I don't think that is unique to us. I don't think our county is experiencing a huge, on average, we detain about 52 people a month for mental health. SUD ITAs, that's a fairly new process for us, and because there's only 2 secure detoxes, we don't use it as much as we'd like to because Cameron hit on some things earlier. A lot of these 2 secure detoxes can be pretty particular with who they'll take and who they won't take. So there's some barriers there.
And then, thank you. And then the other part of the question is the increases, and I'm just only asking because the increases seem pretty substantial for a 1-year increase. Is part of that going to be because either it's a problem that members of the community and funding organizations in the state are now focusing on more than they used to, or is it these problems are coming, the people that are in crisis that are having these problems are seeking you out, more than they used to? Maybe they're learning more about programs they didn't know of before.
Yeah, I think it's actually a very important thing that, I think our region needs to look at. I don't really have a specific, I have suspicions. I think that we all do who provide care. We know substance use plays a huge role in psychiatric presentation. I think that there is potential that the more we create resources and market those resources, people do access those resources, which is good. I do have concerns that, that we need to use some more least restrictive options. It's a higher cost service to hospitalize someone than to put them in a crisis stabilization bed, for example. So I think we really need to look at those funds and how we're routing those funds and what makes the most sense. Because you're right, I think it is a substantial increase, and we need to sit down and go, okay, why is that? There's probably a ton of factors as to why that is. But if there's something that we can impact, we should definitely know that and try to impact that. I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do with our True Blood efforts and embedding people in law enforcement is try to get it quick and early and try to divert it before it, escalates to the point you can't divert it away from any system.
You talked a little bit about crisis stabilization beds. I guess my question would be, with the integration of the MCOs, how has that impacted crisis stabilization beds? And I guess how many beds do you have in your area that you're utilizing?
So Yakima has 16 beds, and again, we use those interchangeably for subacute detox or crisis stabilization. So any given day, the census could be tilted one way or another. In Walla Walla, Waypoint has 6 crisis stabilization beds, and then the rest are used for the residential, but again, we have some flex there. Again, I know before January 2018, our average length of stay was 3 to 5 days. It's now down to under 2. So, I mean, the obvious impact is the fact that we are authorized payment for a certain number of days.
So, for us, having a crisis stabilization bed here in the community, which we don't currently have, was just a therapeutic foster home that a youth could go to. And there was that family was getting paid the entire time, just for being licensed, whether they had someone in the bed or not. And it's costing. There is someone in the bed. There's benefit to the organization that is overseeing that, right? When there's not someone in the bed, the NCOs aren't going to pay for that. And so the organization continues to have to pay for that. Is that different than where you're at? Because prior to the NCOs, that wasn't as much of a challenge for us to be able to cover that cost.
Right. It depends on the bed and your contract and all of that, but if there's not anyone in the bed, there's not an encounter to bill, there's not a service to bill. So in some areas, they may float that cost. If they're under a capitated payment, you're bearing all the risk, and you serve your folks the best you can, and you move funds, with those capitated payments. But if you're a fee-for-service model, you don't have that flexibility, and some facilities are fee-for-service, so they can't move funds. All right, thank you.
Okay, so our next presenter is going to be from Blues River Counseling, and they're actually through on the phone, so.
Let me unmute him. I asked him, do you know if he has a PowerPoint by chance?
I do not know.
Hang on, Mike, I'm unmuting you just a second.
All right. Good afternoon. This is Mike Burney. I'm from Palouse River Counseling, and I do not have any slides. But what I'll say is to follow up a little bit what Cameron started with. We all, in crisis services across Greater Columbia, we all work under the same statute and have basically the same responsibility. I think we all do things a little bit differently, as you've seen from the earlier presenters about kind of how to provide that service in a way that makes sense to our particular service area. So in Whitman County, we do a little bit of what you've seen with with Lords and with Comprehensive, and a little bit even with Blue Mountain. So in our particular schedule, because of the demand on our services, we have quite a number of DCRs actually, but we have a full-time person dedicated to crisis response who's a DCR for daytimes during business hours. We have a full-time crisis response person for evenings, and then we have a third full-time crisis DCR for weekends. And then we back those people up with other staff that may or may not be DCRs, but are crisis responders. And they kind of like in Blue Mountain or in Kittitas, they also carry caseloads during the day and things like that. And then they fill in if there's vacations for those people that are kind of covering the primary service. In Whitman County, we have less of the specialized care that you've heard from some of the larger counties, but I think our advantage in a lot of ways is we provide the crisis services, and we're also the only community mental health center or community behavioral health center in Whitman County. So it's hard for people to get lost in the cracks because there aren't a lot. They get referred directly into our outpatient services typically. Our other difference a little bit is we have Washington State University, and so we do deal with students somewhat. They have their own student counseling department, but we still see quite a few students in crisis services and actually in our outpatient services as well. But we do have a good connection with the WSU Student Counseling, and of course we do LRA monitoring because we're licensed to do that, and WSU Student Counseling is not. So that's just a little bit about ours. We're a little bit kind of like they were talking about with Yakima County. We are large geographically. We have 2 hospitals in our community. One of those hospitals in the last 2 years has agreed to be a location for single bed certifications if it's a person they feel is appropriate that they can handle. That whole process was talked about earlier by Cameron, I believed. And so ours is very similar to that. As I said, we do LRA monitoring in our community. As they were talking about, I think in Benton and Franklin counties, we do a lot of outreach. And right now, we're doing a lot with the Greek community up at WSU. It seems like we're getting lots of requests from fraternities and sororities. I actually think they have some kind of requirement now that they have training in identifying suicide and some alcohol kinds of things and stuff like that. What else do we want to say? I think that's a big chunk. I believe we have really good connections with our hospitals, with our law enforcement, and the sheriff's department. That's one of the advantages of being a relatively small community. And like I said, our kind of main difference, other than Kittitas County, I don't know how much activity they get from Central, but WSU makes up a big piece of Whitman County in terms of the population. One of the earlier questions, so just to give you an idea about the size, in 2019, we did 28 detentions. 2 of those were SUD detentions. That's both initial and revocations. So that gives you just a little bit of idea of kind of our thing. I think somebody asked about, well, what's the trends? I'm just hoping that we had a really very busy January, and knock on wood, hopefully it'll even out as we move into the rest of the year. But for us, it really goes in cycles. We'll have a really busy month, and then where we do lots of detentions for us, and then we'll have some months where we don't do any detentions either. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have. That's just a little bit about the crisis services in Whitman County.
Yeah. Wait, hold on. I know that look.
Hi, Mike. This is Carol Linder. So I'm going to go back to my regular question in terms of, since you mentioned that you have a lot of population that are college age, do you see a lot of college students that use your services?
We see a fair number in crisis services. The other thing that may be a little unique about us is WSU has a not insignificant number of foreign students. So we'll see a fair number of students that are from from Asia, from China, from South Korea, a variety of places like that. We'll do some detentions with those, and so we have some times that we have to call their embassies, since that's one of the requirements. If you detain certain foreign nationals in their system, so we have some of those kinds of issues. I don't know. I mean, probably out of the 28, I think we did. Oh, I think we had 3 or 4 that were students that were full-time. WSU is pretty much traditional students, but either 3 or 4 people that were individuals that were detained that were students at WSU.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And we have a possibility of our provider that is, represents Loudoun County and Garfield County Quality Behavioral Health. They had a conflict. I'm not sure if they were able to call in and participate. So we're going to try to check now to see if they are on and would like to speak.
Everyone's unmuted.
Everyone is unmuted. So if anyone is on from QBH, you could go ahead and let us know. Okay, so I think QBH is not with us. I said a couple other things to say, and then we'll kind of open it back up for some more questions if anyone has. One other thing just to point out, and also just to comment on a question that was either that Mike brought up or was brought up. It does impact the care when there is a college, especially if it's a relatively big college in that area. It's just, more potential crisis calls and those types of things. I don't really want to speak on behalf of Comprehensive, but did do an audit within probably the last 6 months over there. I talked to them a little about, they have Central Washington University up there in Kittitas. They've really made some significant efforts in the last couple of years to improve the way they're able to interact with them. And I believe their process now is that they do have someone is identified as they have some kind of a crisis call. They're doing some sort of crisis evaluation. They do have access now to multiple people that work at the school, a dean of student affairs. I'm not sure the exact titles, but they are able now to 24/7 reach someone at the university and identify family supports if there's history that people are aware of. So they're able to work in partnership with the schools to get information. Because a lot of the times, the kids going to school might have history somewhere else. It's less likely to be in the community. There's student health centers there. Sometimes kids are getting their services A lot of people that are, unique to the area or new to the area might have just moved there. So that is a challenge that the crisis providers try to develop relationships with schools to better address. The other thing I just wanted to point out, one of the questions we get around stuff is kind of how is this different across the state? Is everyone experiencing some of the same issues? A lot of the issues people do feel around the state, especially the access to hospitals, access into the state hospitals, all of those things. The one thing that does change a little bit for actual services are available across the state is if communities get additional funding. So we get state-only funding from the state for the ASO for our crisis system, and they essentially pass a big pot of money that gets broken down through a formula for our region. Then we get the majority of that portion. The other portion would go to the MCOs that are delivering services in that area, and that's the extent of the funding that we have to provide crisis services, pay for inpatient hospitalizations that are under an ITA, or to potentially try to fund any other non-Medicaid program. A lot of parts of the state have passed local sales tax increases where they have a 0.1% of local sales tax is earmarked to go directly to local mental health services. Just to make a comparison between ourselves and Spokane ASO, which you see on the map is a fairly similar, they have a larger population center, but the overall population of their region is similar to ours. They also deal with rural communities the way some of our providers do as well. They get more or less the same state-only funding as us from the state, but in Spokane County, due to that tax, about $11.5 million a year comes into that system to provide, basically services that would not be covered under Medicaid or people that are not Medicaid eligible. And out of that, I think about $7.5 million goes directly to their ASO. About $3 million of that goes to support hospitalizations and crisis services. Then they're able to run a supportive housing program, $4.5 million. So, places like King County, almost most of the counties on the west side of the state, I believe, except for Pierce, who's currently considering a law like that, do have additional revenue, so those do supplement those systems. So sometimes there are services that are available other places being paid for that it wouldn't be paid for necessarily here, and it's not necessarily because they're using the same funds that we would have to pay for those services. A lot of the time it's because they have additional funds coming in that they do have access to provide those types of programs. So we just wanted to put that out there. And then we can go ahead and move on to Mike. Oh.
Yes. Let me unmute him.
Mike, you're going to be unmuted.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to add in, I'm not sure who was talking about, but that is something that the Dean of Students Office at WSU started probably 4 or 5 months ago, is they have a full-time on-call person in the Dean of Students who, when we're doing crisis service with students, is invaluable because they really, they know the resources up there, they can contact them, they can provide direction, and they know a lot of history about students that we just cannot get, especially if we don't get access to their parents. So that has been an improvement with us at WSU. Sounds like at Central as well. That's been very helpful when you work with universities.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll open it back up to questions. I don't really want to field necessarily a bunch of questions. I feel like most of the questions would be specific maybe to crisis providers. So if anyone does have any questions, if they would like to raise their hand, and then we can try to get whoever will be the most appropriate person to maybe answer that question. So does anyone have any questions about just in general the topics or maybe specific things?
Yeah, so I know everybody all those folks except for maybe boards, all the rest of the agencies are also agencies that provide WISE or some other intensive services that have crisis services sort of built in to what they do. And part of what, when Courtney was talking about the folks who get connected or get routed through their own providers, they don't make it necessarily into that crisis network. And I know even through we route to those that have already connections. Is there a way that the ASO is able to get a full view of the amount of crisis that the non-crisis providers are actually addressing and dealing with in our region? How much of those crises are actually already being absorbed by the community behavioral?
That, as far as just from the ASO perspective, I'm not sure on that. I believe if it's a WISE specific code, it would be going to the MCO and it wouldn't come to us as a crisis code. I'm not sure if there is a way that the MCOs would be able to make that information available, or if it's coming back to us in a different way. That's something I could look into, see if we have any more information about that on the ASO with kind of our people. It's not something I've heard of. It does sound like that would be valuable information to also see what else their impact. WISE teams have not always been in place, and so as WISE teams are doing more crisis services, theoretically the rest of the, it's reducing the amount of crisis services being done by the crisis teams. But I don't have specific information about it.
Yeah, I was just kind of using WISE as an example of that because I think it happens with the adult population as well, that folks, if they already are connected, providers that they have been connected with are sort of absorbing those crises out of the system. And so we may not have a good measure of what the actual load is by just looking at IPAs and hospitalizations and assumed dead service. I'm just kind of trying to figure out how, if that's part of what the statistics when you were saying about the growth, if there's part of those components that are happening as well.
So there's very limited codes, service codes that you can build for crisis, and one of them is a crisis intervention, and another one's a crisis detention, there was a crisis investigation. So as an outpatient provider, if you're meeting the standards of that crisis intervention code, you can bill it. So I know our outpatient teams will bill that code, and then we would have to sort it out from programmatically. So outpatient program is billing this much crisis, acute care is billing this much crisis. And so, yeah, the stats I showed you were all crisis codes attended to by the crisis team. Yeah. As far as WISE goes, I can't remember if they have, if we have a crisis code with a WISE modifier on it, or if, how that piece works, but there's that potential to do some sorting.
Yeah, so within WISE, when we're doing crisis services and programs outside of WISE, here locally we also have the SWIFT program, which these are, again, just youth services, so not speaking to the adult services, but we do code those crisis intervention codes. WISE would have the modifier with it, our SWIFT program would not, but billing those crisis services in that capacity, I guess then trying to figure out, and whether that's partnering with the ASO or what, trying to figure out how do those numbers then, whether it's outpatient or some other level of intensive services, how do those numbers start to be parsed out and included in the numbers when we're reporting on the amount of crisis in a community, which it sounds like we don't know, right?
Right, that's what it sounds like. I'm not sure, and maybe Courtney could speak to this a little more too, if that would also apply to PAC teams.
Right, that would be the other place I would think that you start to see that, or a first episode psychosis program, something like that.
Right, so we do have, so Comprehensive is now running 2 first episode psychosis programs, I believe, in our region, as well as a PAC team. Lourdes also runs a PAC team.
Right, and again, that's coding, I'd have to go back and see if we built those codes. As long as it meets the standard of the code, it's a Medicaid eligible code. And so if you can tack on a WISE modifier or a PACT modifier,
within the state, you can add what they call modifiers to your service codes that say this was a packed service or this was a live service, to kind of help cluster those services.
Did anyone have it else? Did anyone else have any questions for any of the providers that we had? And also, if there was any, we had pretty quick times with our providers. If there was any provider maybe that had something that they were wanting to say or thought of anything sense or anything they would like to add, we do have a little extra time to make time available for any providers that'd like to talk about a program that they had not mentioned or something that's, the other conversations have brought something up for them.
Yeah, no, one thing that I forgot to mention was we're rolling out a lot of peer support and putting them into lines of services that we traditionally didn't have them in before. And so we are getting ready to put peer support in our jail services for Benton County, as well as moving that towards crisis. We have 3 for our True Blood program, I think 2 for STAR and Pathfinder, and maybe missing some others, but we're making the move to get peer specialists in all lines of service, and find that is valuable. And so, speaking from a traditional standpoint, it has given us another layer where consumers provide us with feedback that they feel like for a lot of them the first time that they've ever been talked to rather than at. And we can meet people where they're at, come out of the community, share experiences, lived in experiences. So we are moving to add those into additional lines of service that we already have as well.
Okay. And were there any other providers that were here that have anything else they would like to add? Okay, so I think we are a little ahead of schedule. I think one thing we could ask is, in the room, at least with the providers that are in attendance, if you could maybe hang around a little while after to answer if anybody does have any specific questions or anything that they had about a program or any other networking type of things, people wanting to know more about programs from the people in the room. We'll be hanging out here for a while as well if there are any questions specifically to the ASO. So maybe for the next 15 minutes or so, if anybody does have questions, we'll try to stay available. But we appreciate everyone coming, especially appreciate our providers also making the time and having the presentations. It's very helpful. Thank you.
We just want to thank you guys for your presentations today. It was really great to understand the program and in all the different areas. And so also this recording will be available on our website so that anybody would like to reference it in the future, that's where it will be. And thank you guys so much. We'll see you. Hopefully you come to next month. Alison Masari, she's going to be great. So we'll see you then.
Great. It is. I almost dipped out of the field. So here I am. My girl is pretty awesome.
After hours law enforcement.